Good afternoon, class. I'm so excited you could be here on this sunny afternoon. Today's lesson is titled Fashion Revolution, the 1960s. So we're going to be talking about all the great events that happened in the 1960s that influenced fashion in that decade as well as the modern day decade. Just so you know, the full PowerPoint is available online, but it would be to your benefit to go ahead and take notes now. Our objective today is, given information regarding historical events of the 1960s, the student will analyze information from the presentation to draw conclusions about how pivotal events influence the modern-day fashion industry. Does everyone here understand the objective?
Yes.
Has anyone here studied the 1960s before?
Not yet.
Well, that's good because we're going to be going over a lot of information this afternoon, so hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll have a much more thorough understanding of the decade. And just to let you guys know, fashion history is important because it gives us insight into not only where we've come from in terms of socially, economically, but also in terms of fashion trends. So we can predict a lot of today's trends by seeing where we've come from in the past. So let's go ahead and dive right in and review the major events of the 1960s. In 1960, the FDA approved birth control, which set off a major feminist movement. Women felt a lot freer, and they kind of expressed that freedom through a lot of fashion trends. And also in that year, John F. Kennedy was elected president, ushering into the White House a new First Lady, Jackie O, who, as we all know, is and was a style icon. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was erected. Freedom rides began throughout the South. The Russians put the first man on the moon, and Alan Shepard, an American, makes the first suborbital flight. So remember those space events especially because they come into play a lot later as we discuss trends in the 1960s. In 1962, the Pop Art Symposium at the Museum of Modern Art in New York made a big splash both on the art scene and on the fashion scene. John Glenn, another American, orbited the Earth, and The Silent Spring, which is a feminist work by Rachel Cairn, is published, describing the plight of college-educated women who are unsatisfied with being simply housewives and want to go to work but feel like they can't. Some more events in the 1960s included, in 1963, there was a giant civil rights rally in D.C. John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The Feminine Mystique, which is another feminist book, was published. And the Beatles released the record I Want to Hold Your Hand. Has everyone heard of that record here?
I love the Beatles.
I love the Beatles too. So we're going to be talking a lot more about them because they really influenced fashion through their music in the United States and in all across Europe. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Bill, and Martin Luther King won the Nobel Peace Prize. So that was a really big decade for equal rights in the United States. And then in 1965, mod ready-to-wear hit the U.S. market, which was partially due to Beatlemania, which hit with the single I Want to Hold Your Hand in 1963. In 1966, the National Organization for Women, also known as NOW, was founded. In 1967, there was a giant Be-In for Peace to protest the Vietnam War in Central Park, where over 10,000 youths gathered. In 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and Richard Nixon was elected president, which definitely changed the feeling of the nation. And then in 1969, I'm sure you're all familiar with this event, Woodstock was in 1969, and Apollo 2 landed on the moon. So that was just a quick summary of events of the 1960s. Now let's continue our discussion of the 1960s by exploring the lifestyle influences of the decade. Music was a giant influence on fashion. We spoke about Woodstock in 1969. It was a place for hippies to live communally, experience art and craft shows, music, free love, and getting stoned. Some performers were Janis Joplin, Creedence Clearwater Revival, otherwise known as CCR, Jimi Hendrix, and Sly and the Family Stone. The other big musical influence of the 1960s was the Beatles. Beatlemania hit in 1963 in the U.S. It brought the mod style from Carnaby Street, which is a major fashion street in London, to the United States. And later, the Beatles became famous for their hippie style, their long hair, and their hippie lifestyle. Also, if anyone's familiar with the song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, we all know that it means LSD, so they kind of dived headfirst into the hippie lifestyle. And here is a picture that I brought today of some youths experiencing Beatlemania. This is a bunch of screaming girls at a concert. Does this remind anyone of a Justin Bieber concert?
I love Justin Bieber.
Okay, and let's dive from music straight into movies. Audrey Hepburn was a huge star in the 1960s. She did many films, Roman Holiday, Paris When It Sizzles, but the most famous one, especially today, is Breakfast at Tiffany's. Audrey Hepburn appeared as a Chanel-wearing socialite, Holly Golightly, which we now call a escort, shall we say. She made famous in that movie the bouffant hairstyle, the little black dress, and she was also really loyal to the designer Givenchy. So in a lot of her films, including Sabrina, which was one in 1954, she introduced the American public to Givenchy, who was a French designer. Especially in the movie How to Steal a Million, the lead actor even makes a comment on her Givenchy dress. Just through her popularity, she also made the term unpopular in the 1960s. She was seen in one in 1954 in the movie Sabrina. And Michael Kors said, "Today women take for granted the things that they wear, but if it hadn't been for Audrey Hepburn, they wouldn't be wearing them." So she was definitely a major influence both on the 1960s and today. This is Audrey Hepburn in one of her shots for Breakfast at Tiffany's wearing the Chanel. It wasn't little, but it was a long black dress. And that dress is from the opening scene. Moving right along to another big movie star of the era was Brigitte Bardot. She was more the antagonist to Audrey Hepburn, whereas Audrey Hepburn was very ladylike and poised. Brigitte Bardot was the innocent sex kitten. She was French. She's very famous for being the first star to wear a bikini to the Cannes Film Festival. She was famous for her Charoche hairstyle. She was very loyal to Mary Quant and her mini skirts. She wore shorts, striped sailor's t-shirts, and bright red flats. So she made a lot of the trends that we're seeing revived today really popular in the 1960s. She was in movies like A Very Private Affair, Viva Maria, 2 Weeks in September, and Les Femmes. This is a picture of Brigitte Bardot as she was seen in Cannes in the 1960s, the first star to wear the bikini. Okay, let's move on to some of the art of the era. Op art and pop art became extremely popular in the 1960s. Pop art glorified everyday items, and op art tricked the eye with bright optical themes. So an example of op art would be the Campbell Soup famous painting, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about pop art, but here's an example. This is the Mondrian dress by Yves Saint Laurent. It is a copy of the Mondrian painting. And op art, as we can see, was often translated into fabric and was a large influence on fashion. So again, here, this piece of op art was translated into one of the most famous dresses of the 1960s, and I personally had a very similar dress when I was a little girl. So you can see how it influenced today's fashion. Let's move on to the style tribes. The mods began in England through Beatlemania and came to the U.S. through the Beatles. Love, they were all about love, self-expression, poetry, and again, getting stoned, a big theme we're seeing in the 1960s. Mary Quant was the poster girl for this tribe. She was a major designer in London that we'll discuss more later in the presentation. But she was known for her miniskirts that the mods were in love with, and they were also in love with bright and bold patterns, and the peacock revolution, which is a trend where men dress very extravagantly, femininely, lots of colors, lots of patterns, etc. So here is an example of one of the mod styles. This is
looks
a collection.
like Austin Powers.
It does look like Austin Powers. I guess Austin Powers did a great job in wardrobing. This is Pierre Cardin's Cosmos collection from the 1960s. Okay. There was another major style tribe that I'm sure you all know about, the hippies. They were famous for their participation in Woodstock, famous for their participation in the Be-In in 1967. They, like the mods, were all for self-expression, free love, music, poetry, and getting high. They wanted to revolutionize social norms. They were really well known for their long hair, long skirts, their thrift store clothes. A lot of men wore love beads, women wore headbands, and they were really famous for the gypsy hippie look. I have a picture here of two hippie guys relaxing at Woodstock, listening to some music, probably before Jimi Hendrix came out. So the hippies were a big style influence. Does anybody see any hippie influence from the 1960s in today's fashion?
Yes. All the peace signs.
Definitely.
All the bright colors.
Exactly. So, yay,
a lot of the
hippies.
crocheted vests that are becoming popular again.
Exactly. The macrame vest was really big for the hippies. I actually have one from the 1960s because I am a secret hippie. So now you know. Okay. Let's continue talking about lifestyle trends in the 1960s by talking about music. Oh, you know what? Actually, we already discussed that. Let's continue talking about significant designers. We're going to take a look at the significant designers of the decade. We mentioned a little earlier Mary Quant, a designer from London, and her miniskirts that the mods were really in love with. She actually invented the miniskirt as a response to the youthful revolt against tradition and the feminist movement. I know we talked at the very beginning of the presentation about how birth control was legalized in 1960. So the miniskirt was actually a response to that new freedom. She was also famous for colorful plastic shoes, colored socks, her 5-point haircut, and she made London a center of fashion. So here is a picture of Mary Quant. She's the one in black in the long white necktie with some mods wearing her designs. Okay. Let's talk a minute about Yves Saint Laurent and Chanel. Yves Saint Laurent was famous for see-through blouses, the Mondrian dress that we discussed earlier with the op art and pop art movement, and he was known as the king of fashion in the 1960s. We all know and love Chanel if we're in fashion. She regained her popularity in the 1960s through Jackie Kennedy, who was constantly seen in her boxy suits. And here I have a photo of Jackie getting off the plane with JFK in a pink Chanel suit. Okay. And there were two really well-known space-age designers. Andrew Correhair was really known for low-heeled white boots, which are known as go-go boots today. He was really also famous for hardline mini dresses and using industrial zippers, which is something we've seen come back in the past couple years. And Pierre Cardin, I showed you a picture earlier, but just to refresh your memory, he was famous for this collection, which was the Cosmos collection. So really hardline, very colorful dresses inspired by the space movement, which we talked about in our timeline of world events. From designers, let's go ahead and jump into the modern day trends. Now that we've examined the major events and styles of the 1960s, we should discuss the ways in which the 1960s fashions influence modern day trends. So let's start with one of my favorite leading ladies, Katy Perry. This is a picture of the lovely Katy Perry, and she emulates Brigitte Bardot's sex kitten look through her wardrobe, hair, and makeup choices. Does everyone see the similarity between Bridget Bardot and Katy Perry in this picture?
Yes.
Definitely the bikini, kind of her innocent but still sexy look. Very Bridget Bardot inspired. Another modern look that is updated from the 60s is Chanel and Jackie O. Okay. Jackie Kennedy is still a huge fashion icon today. Her famed Chanel suits have been revamped by Karl Lagerfeld and are a modern staple for the chic girl's wardrobe. The House of Harlow is Starlet Nicole's Richie line, and she's based her entire clothing line and accessories for the House of Harlow on vintage designs from the 1960s.